February 28, 1953. Late evening. Inside the Kremlin, a film projector flickers to life. Four men sit in uncomfortable silence, watching whatever movie their leader has selected for them tonight. They cannot leave until he dismisses them. They cannot refuse the invitation. They are among the most powerful figures in the Soviet Union. Yet at this moment, they are prisoners of ritual. The man who holds them captive is 74 years old, suffering from high blood pressure, arteriosclerosis, and increasing paranoia. His health has been failing for years, but his grip on power remains absolute. In less than 24 hours, he will collapse. In 5 days, he will be dead. And the four men watching this movie with him will face a choice that could determine not just their own fates, but the future of the Soviet Union itself. This is the story of the final 24 hours of Joseph Stalin. What happened during that last evening? Why did it take so long for anyone to help him? And was his death truly an accident, or something far more sinister? To understand Stalin's final day, we need to understand the atmosphere of terror that surrounded him in early 1953. For nearly 3 decades, Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union through fear. Millions had died in political purges, forced collectivization that led to famine, and the vast network of labor camps known as the Gulag. By 1953, Stalin had outlived most of his revolutionary comrades. Many he had executed himself, but Stalin's paranoia had not diminished with age. If anything, it had intensified. In January 1953, Soviet media announced the arrest of 9 doctors, 6 of them Jewish, accused of plotting to murder Soviet leaders through medical malpractice. The announcement spoke of a criminal group of killer doctors who had supposedly been responsible for the deaths of prominent Soviet officials. More arrests followed. Jewish doctors across the Soviet Union found themselves targeted. Patients refused treatment from Jewish physicians. There were attacks in the streets. This was the doctors' plot, and it bore all the hallmarks of Stalin's previous purges: forced confessions, wild accusations of conspiracy, growing lists of suspects. Those who had lived through the Great Terror of the 1930s recognized the pattern. Stalin was preparing another wave of eliminations, and this time the target was Soviet Jews. There were even rumors that Stalin planned mass deportations to Siberia. The arrested physicians were subjected to brutal interrogations. They were forced to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, to name accomplices who didn't exist, to describe conspiracies that had never happened. One of the arrested doctors was Vladimir Vinogradov, who had been Stalin's personal physician for years. Vinogradov had made the mistake of suggesting in 1952 that Stalin needed to reduce his workload and take better care of his health. Stalin had flown into a rage and ordered his arrest. The message was clear. No one could tell Stalin what to do, not even doctors trying to save his life. The doctors' plot created an atmosphere of medical terror. Doctors were afraid to treat important patients because a bad outcome might mean arrest. Patients were afraid to see doctors, especially Jewish ones, because they might be part of the alleged conspiracy. This climate of fear would have direct consequences when Stalin himself needed urgent medical care. The terror extended to Stalin's inner circle. The 4 men who surrounded him in early 1953, Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikolai Bulganin, had survived previous purges by being useful, by being ruthless, and by never appearing too ambitious. But they knew their positions were precarious. Stalin had turned on trusted lieutenants before. He could do so again. Malenkov, at 51, was Stalin's deputy in the Council of Ministers, and widely seen as the likely successor. But that designation was meaningless. Stalin had destroyed previous heirs apparent. Malenkov had been criticized years earlier for problems in aircraft production during World War II. Would Stalin remember? Would he care? Beria, 53, controlled the secret police and the Soviet atomic weapons program. He was perhaps the most feared man in the Soviet Union after Stalin himself. Vicious, intelligent, and utterly without morals, Beria had built a network of informants and assassins that reached into every corner of Soviet life. But he too had been criticized by Stalin for promoting members of his own ethnic group, the Mingrelians, to positions of power. In Stalin's paranoid mind, such ethnic loyalty might constitute treason. Khrushchev, 58, was first secretary of the Moscow Communist Party. A peasant's son who had risen through brutal competence and survival instincts, Khrushchev had weathered Stalin's criticism for attempting agricultural reforms that failed. He knew Stalin viewed him as crude and uneducated, but crudeness had its advantages. Stalin sometimes underestimated those he considered intellectually inferior. Bulganin, 57, was Minister of Defense. The least powerful of the four, he had survived by being reliable without being threatening. But even he was not safe. In Stalin's world, no one was safe. These four men had been summoned many times before for evenings like the one that began on February 28th. Stalin's late-night gatherings were a regular occurrence, a way for him to keep watch over his subordinates while demonstrating his power. The pattern was always the same: a movie at the Kremlin, then a drive to Stalin's dacha at Kuntsevo outside Moscow. Dinner, heavy drinking, conversation that could turn dangerous without warning, and no one could leave until Stalin dismissed them, which meant these sessions often lasted until dawn. The evening of February 28th began in the Kremlin. Stalin and his four guests watched a film. No one recorded which movie they saw that night. It doesn't matter. The movie was never the point. The point was control. Stalin chose when they watched. He chose when they stopped. He chose when they moved to the next phase of the evening. After the movie ended, sometime after midnight, the five men were driven to Stalin's dacha in Kuntsevo, about 10 miles from central Moscow. The near dacha, as it was called, had been Stalin's primary residence since the 1930s. Built by the secret police on wooded grounds, the dacha was a modest two-story wooden structure. Nothing like the opulent palaces of the czars. Stalin affected a certain asceticism in his personal surroundings, though the simplicity masked the extensive security and the absolute power he wielded from this retreat. The drive through the darkness must have been tense. Each man knew that these evenings could turn dangerous. Stalin's moods were unpredictable. He might spend hours in jovial reminiscence, or he might suddenly turn cold and accusatory. A wrong word, an inappropriate laugh. Even an expression that Stalin interpreted as disrespectful could have consequences. Men had been arrested for less. The dacha had at least 10 rooms, plus a long veranda where Stalin sometimes sat, even in winter, wrapped in furs. There was a banquet hall for entertaining, which is where the group settled in for dinner. The meal was simple by the standards of the Kremlin elite: salted meats, pickled vegetables, cheese, black bread. Stalin preferred Georgian dishes, but this night the food was secondary to the drinking. Stalin had always used alcohol as a weapon. He would press drinks on his subordinates while remaining relatively sober himself, watching how they behaved when their guards were down. Who talked too much? Who said something indiscreet? Who looked at whom with suspicion or alliance? Alcohol loosened tongues and revealed ambitions. It also exhausted his guests, keeping them up until they could barely think straight. The psychological pressure was immense. Each man had to drink enough to show loyalty and camaraderie, but not so much that they lost control of their faculties. They had to be entertaining, but not too clever. Deferential, but not obsequious. Alert, but relaxed. It was an exhausting performance that lasted for hours. That night followed the pattern. Wine and vodka flowed freely. Stalin drank, but his subordinates drank more. The conversation ranged across state business, gossip, reminiscences. At some point, according to later accounts, they discussed the ongoing interrogations of the arrested doctors. Stalin was pleased with how the investigation was progressing. More names were being added to the list of conspirators. The atmosphere was relatively good-humored, at least by Stalin's standards. He joked with Khrushchev, poking him in the stomach and calling him Mykola, the Ukrainian form of his name. Stalin only used that nickname when he was in a good mood. Khrushchev would later recall feeling relieved that the evening was passing without incident. These dinners did not always end well. As the hours dragged on, the guests grew increasingly exhausted, but they could not suggest leaving. They could not plead fatigue or important work in the morning. They sat and drank and talked until Stalin decided the evening was over. Finally, around 4 a.m. on March 1st, Stalin stood. The evening was concluded. The four men rose, grateful to escape. Stalin walked with them to the entrance hall, still in good spirits, still joking. He saw them off personally, waving as they departed. Khrushchev and Bulganin left in one car. Beria and Malenkov left together in another. They drove back toward Moscow through the cold darkness of early morning. Behind them, Stalin returned to his private quarters. The staff and guards heard him moving about for a while, then silence. Before retiring, Stalin gave an unusual order. According to the testimony of his bodyguards, he told them through an intermediary not to disturb him. He didn't need anything. Everyone should go to bed. No one should enter his rooms until he called for them. This was strange. Stalin typically followed a routine. He would sleep late, usually until midday, then ring for breakfast and the day's mail. But the explicit order not to disturb him was unprecedented. Nevertheless, the guards obeyed. They were terrified of disobeying Stalin's orders. The consequences could be fatal. March 1st passed in unnatural silence. The sun rose. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became evening. No sound came from Stalin's quarters. No bell rang. No order was given. The motion sensors installed in Stalin's rooms detected no movement. The guards grew increasingly worried. Something was wrong, but what could they do? Stalin had explicitly ordered them not to disturb him. He had punished people for less than violating his direct commands. The guards knew what happened to those who displeased Stalin. Arrest, interrogation, confession to crimes they didn't commit, execution or decades in the gulag. These were not ordinary security guards. They were carefully selected members of Stalin's personal protection detail, men who had been vetted repeatedly, whose families were essentially hostages to their loyalty. They had witnessed arrests before. They had seen people disappear. Some of them had participated in delivering prisoners to interrogation facilities. They understood the machinery of state terror from the inside, which made them all the more cautious. The psychological trap they found themselves in was perfect. If they entered Stalin's room without permission, and he was merely sleeping or working and didn't want to be disturbed, they could be arrested for violating his explicit orders. But if something was truly wrong and they failed to act, they could be arrested for negligence. Either action could result in destruction, so they waited. Paralyzed by the perfect bind of totalitarian fear, so they waited. Hour after hour they waited, paralyzed by fear and protocol. They conferred in whispers. They checked and rechecked the motion sensors. They strained to hear any sound from Stalin's quarters. Nothing. The silence stretched from hours into nearly an entire day. Around 6 in the evening, a light came on in Stalin's room. The guards relaxed slightly. He was awake. He was moving. Perhaps everything was normal after all. Perhaps he had simply wanted to sleep undisturbed. Perhaps he was working on some secret project that required absolute privacy. They convinced themselves that everything was fine, even as their instincts screamed that it wasn't. But more hours passed. Still no summons. Still no orders. The guards' anxiety returned, stronger than before. Finally, around 10 o'clock that night, the guards found a pretext. Mail had arrived. Important government documents that required Stalin's personal attention. They could deliver the mail. That wasn't disturbing him. That was fulfilling their duty. One of the guards, Peter Lozgachev, entered Stalin's private quarters. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Stalin was lying on the floor of the small dining room, next to a table. He was wearing his pajama trousers and an undershirt. He had clearly fallen and been unable to get up. There was a pool of urine on the floor. Stalin's right arm and leg were paralyzed. He couldn't speak coherently, only managing confused sounds. His eyes showed awareness, but also terror. He knew something terrible had happened to him, but he couldn't communicate. He couldn't call for help. He couldn't give orders. The all-powerful dictator who had ruled an empire, who had commanded armies, who had signed death warrants for millions, lay helpless on his dacha floor, unable even to ask for water. The guards lifted Stalin onto a nearby sofa. One of them called the dacha commandant. The commandant called the Minister of State Security, Semyon Ignatiev. Ignatiev didn't dare make decisions about Stalin's health on his own authority. He ordered the guards to call Malenkov and Beria. Here, the timeline becomes murky, and the confusion may not have been accidental. According to some accounts, Malenkov called Khrushchev around 2 in the morning on March 2nd. He said that Beria and Bulganin already knew about the situation, and all 4 should go immediately to Kuntsevo. But other accounts suggest that Beria and Malenkov arrived first, alone, around 3 in the morning. They went into Stalin's room briefly. Stalin had been moved from the floor to a couch and covered with a blanket. Beria looked at him and declared loudly that there was nothing wrong. Stalin was simply sleeping off the previous night's drinking. The guards were panicking over nothing. "What are you panicking for?" Beria reportedly shouted. "The boss is sound asleep. Let's go, Malenkov." Then Beria and Malenkov left. They drove back to Moscow, telling the guards not to call anyone else and not to spread alarm. This was extraordinary behavior. The guards had found Stalin unconscious on the floor. He had been lying there for perhaps 18 hours. He was clearly in medical distress. Yet Beria's response was to declare nothing was wrong and leave. Did Beria genuinely believe Stalin was just drunk? That seems unlikely. Even if Stalin was covered by a blanket, everyone present could smell that he had lost control of his bodily functions. His clothes hadn't been changed. He was clearly suffering from something more serious than a hangover. So why did Beria leave? Why did he order the guards not to call doctors? Why did he tell them not to contact anyone else? Several hours passed before the other members of the inner circle arrived. Khrushchev came around 7:30 in the morning. Only then did anyone summon medical professionals, and even then, there were delays. The doctors who finally arrived at Stalin's dacha around 7 in the morning faced an impossible situation. They examined Stalin and diagnosed what was obvious. He had suffered a massive stroke, a hemorrhage in the left hemisphere of his brain. His blood pressure was dangerously high. His right side was paralyzed. He drifted in and out of consciousness. But what could the doctors do? The best doctors in Moscow had been arrested as part of the doctors' plot. The physicians who had treated Stalin for years were in prison, some already dead from interrogations. The doctors summoned to Kuntsevo were second-tier physicians, specialists who had never treated Stalin before, who had no medical history to guide them, who were terrified of making any mistake. They knew about the doctor's plot. Everyone in Soviet medicine knew about it. The accusations hung over every physician in Moscow like a death sentence. Now they were being asked to treat the very man who had ordered those arrests, the man whose paranoia about doctors had created this crisis in the first place. If Stalin died under their care, would they be accused of murdering him? If he lived but remained disabled, would they be blamed for inadequate treatment? The medical team tried various treatments. They applied leeches to Stalin's neck and face to reduce his blood pressure, an old-fashioned therapy that had been largely abandoned by modern medicine. Why leeches? Perhaps because it was a traditional treatment that couldn't be accused of being part of any Western medical conspiracy. Perhaps because the doctors were too frightened to use more aggressive modern interventions. They administered medications cautiously. They monitored his vital signs constantly, but none of them dared suggest bold action. The irony was brutal. Stalin had destroyed the Soviet medical establishment through his paranoid purge, and now when he needed expert medical care, there was no one left who could provide it. The doctors he trusted were in prison. The doctors at his bedside were terrified to act decisively. For 3 days, Stalin lingered between life and death. The dacha filled with people. Members of the Politburo came and went. Medical bulletins were prepared. Discussions began about what would happen after Stalin died, though no one spoke those words explicitly. Stalin's daughter Svetlana arrived and was devastated by her father's condition. She would later describe watching him struggle to breathe, his face changing color, his body convulsing. She described his death as horrible, a slow suffocation that everyone witnessed. The inner circle members stood around Stalin's deathbed with varying expressions. Some accounts say Beria appeared almost cheerful at moments, relieved that Stalin was dying. Other witnesses saw Beria weeping and kissing Stalin's hands, playing the role of devoted subordinate. Which version was true? Perhaps both. Beria was a consummate actor, capable of showing whatever emotion served his purposes. Khrushchev appeared genuinely distressed, though whether from grief or from fear of what would come next is impossible to say. Malenkov seemed withdrawn, already calculating the political consequences. Bulganin remained in the background, as always. Stalin's condition deteriorated steadily. His breathing became more labored. His periods of consciousness grew shorter. The hemorrhage in his brain continued to expand. putting pressure on vital centers that controlled breathing and heart function. On the evening of March 5th, Stalin's breathing changed. It became irregular, gasping. His face took on a bluish tinge. Those present knew the end was near. The Dachau room filled with an oppressive silence broken only by the sounds of Stalin's labored breathing. The people gathered around the deathbed represented the power structure of the Soviet Union. Members of the Politburo, military commanders, Stalin's daughter Svetlana, his son Vasily, who arrived drunk and shouting accusations at the doctors. Each person there had their own complex relationship with the dying man. Some had genuine affection for him. Some feared him. Some hated him but couldn't show it. And some were already calculating what his death would mean for their own power and survival. Then, according to Svetlana's account, something extraordinary happened. Stalin, who had been unconscious for long periods, suddenly opened his eyes. He looked around the room, and his expression was terrible. Svetlana described it as full of fear and perhaps anger, a final look of rage at the people surrounding him, at the fate that had come for him, at death itself. It was as if, in those last seconds, Stalin understood what was happening and wanted to fight it, to command it away, as he had commanded everything else in his life. Stalin lifted his left arm, the one that still worked. He raised it as if pointing at something, or gesturing at someone, or perhaps delivering a final curse. His hand trembled in the air, the fingers grasping at nothing. Those watching would later disagree about what the gesture meant. Was he pointing accusingly at someone in the room? Was he trying to give one last order? Was it simply the involuntary movement of a dying brain? The ambiguity made the moment even more unsettling. Then it fell. His arm dropped to the bed. His eyes closed. His breathing stopped. There was a moment of absolute stillness, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see if he would somehow rise again, if death itself could be defied by sheer will. Joseph Stalin died at 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953. He was 74 years old. His reign of terror had lasted nearly 3 decades. And even at the moment of his death, those present were terrified. One of the medical aides rushed forward and began giving Stalin artificial respiration, trying to massage his heart, trying to revive him. The doctors had to physically stop the man. They couldn't risk Stalin coming back to life. The fear he inspired was so profound that even his corpse seemed dangerous. The room remained silent for several moments after the doctors confirmed death. No one wanted to be the first to speak, the first to move, the first to acknowledge that the era of Stalin was over. They all understood that the next hours and days would be critical. The struggle for power that had been postponed by Stalin's lingering death would now begin. Who would lead the Soviet Union? How would the transition be managed? Everyone in that room had survived Stalin's paranoia by being cautious, calculating, and ruthless. The autopsy revealed what the doctors already knew. A massive hemorrhage in the left cerebral hemisphere had destroyed critical brain structures. Stalin's arteries were hardened by years of atherosclerosis, a consequence of his heavy smoking, high blood pressure, and general disregard for medical advice. His heart showed damage. His stomach and intestinal tract showed hemorrhaging. His body had been failing for years. The official medical bulletin emphasized that the stroke was natural, the irreversible result of long-standing hypertension and vascular disease. No medical intervention could have saved him once the hemorrhage occurred. But was it natural? The question has persisted for decades. Did Stalin die from his failing health, or was he murdered? Beria remains the primary suspect in most conspiracy theories. He had motive. Stalin was preparing another purge, and Beria might have been on the list. He had opportunity. He was one of the first to arrive at the Dachau after Stalin collapsed, and he had control over Stalin's security staff. He had the means. As head of the secret police, Beria had access to any poison he wanted. Some historians have suggested that Stalin was given warfarin, a tasteless anticoagulant used as rat poison. A dose of warfarin wouldn't kill immediately, but it would thin the blood and make a stroke far more likely and far more severe. It would cause internal bleeding, the hemorrhaging in Stalin's stomach and intestines. Details that were suppressed from the initial autopsy report might support this theory. The timing is suggestive. Stalin suffered his stroke during the early hours of March 1st, just hours after the dinner party ended. If something was added to his food or drink that evening, it would have had time to take effect while Stalin was alone in his quarters. Beria's strange behavior at the dacha, declaring Stalin merely drunk and ordering everyone not to call doctors, might have been an attempt to delay medical attention, ensuring that Stalin would die before effective treatment could be administered. After Stalin's death, Beria reportedly told people that he had saved them all from Stalin. Whether he meant he had saved them by letting Stalin die without immediate medical care, or by something more direct, remains unclear. But there's no conclusive proof. The autopsy found no poison. The symptoms Stalin displayed, paralysis, loss of speech, high blood pressure, progressive deterioration, all fit the pattern of a hemorrhagic stroke. Stalin's health had been declining for years. He had suffered a previous stroke in 1945. He smoked heavily. He had uncontrolled hypertension. He worked brutal hours and subjected himself to enormous stress. His death at 74 from a massive stroke is entirely consistent with natural causes. The alternative explanation is simpler. Stalin's subordinates, when confronted with his collapse, chose not to act urgently. They delayed calling doctors. When doctors arrived, they were terrified to treat Stalin aggressively. The best physicians were in prison. The available doctors used ineffective treatments like leeches rather than modern medicine. Everyone was paralyzed by fear and by the recognition that Stalin's death might solve many problems. Perhaps Beria didn't poison Stalin. Perhaps he simply allowed nature to take its course, deliberately delaying medical intervention that might have saved the dictator's life, or at least prolonged it. That's not quite murder, but it's not quite innocence either. The day after Stalin's death, Soviet radio announced the news to the nation. The announcement came from Yuri Levitan, whose voice was famous throughout the Soviet Union for reading wartime bulletins. Citizens gathered around radios to hear that their leader, the man they had been taught to revere as the father of the Soviet people, was gone. Reactions varied. Some people wept genuinely. Stalin's cult of personality had been so pervasive, so relentless, that millions truly believed he was essential to the nation. They couldn't imagine the Soviet Union without Stalin. They mourned him as they would mourn a parent. Others felt relief but couldn't show it. In Stalin's Soviet Union, insufficient grief could be evidence of disloyalty. People who didn't cry enough at Stalin's funeral might find themselves under suspicion. So they mourned publicly, while feeling privately grateful that the tyrant was finally gone. Stalin's body was embalmed and placed on display in the Hall of Columns in Moscow. For 3 days, hundreds of thousands of people filed past the coffin to pay their respects. The crowds were enormous. People waited hours in freezing weather for their chance to see Stalin one final time. On March 9th, Stalin's funeral took place. His body was carried through Moscow to Red Square in a massive procession. The ceremony was elaborate, befitting a leader who had ruled the Soviet Union for 3 decades. Speakers praised his achievements, his wisdom, his irreplaceable role in Soviet history. Khrushchev opened the ceremony. Malenkov, Beria, and Molotov all delivered eulogies. They spoke of their sorrow at his loss and their determination to continue his work. Yet even as they praised Stalin, the struggle for power had already begun. On the day Stalin died, before his death was announced, a meeting had taken place. The inner circle had gathered to redistribute positions. They had essentially removed Stalin from power while he was still technically alive, still fighting for breath on his deathbed. Malenkov became chairman of the Council of Ministers, taking Stalin's role as head of government. Khrushchev took the chief position in the Communist Party Central Committee. Beria received control of the combined Ministries of Internal Affairs and State Security, uniting under his command all the instruments of state terror. Bulganin became Minister of Defense. For a brief moment, it seemed Beria might emerge as the new strongman. He controlled the secret police. He had a network of loyalists throughout the security apparatus. He moved quickly to consolidate power, even pardoning many of the doctors arrested in the doctors' plot, presenting himself as a reformer. But Beria had underestimated his opponents. Khrushchev and Malenkov, despite their own rivalry, recognized that Beria was too dangerous to allow to accumulate more power. In June 1953, Just 3 months after Stalin's death, Beria was arrested at a Politburo meeting. The charges against him were numerous: treason, terrorism, counter-revolutionary activity, working for British intelligence. Interestingly, he was not charged with any role in Stalin's death. Beria was tried in secret and executed in December 1953, shot by a firing squad. His last words reportedly were a plea for mercy. He received none. The man who had ordered thousands of executions, who had built the Gulag system, who had terrorized the Soviet Union for decades, was eliminated by his former colleagues with the same ruthlessness he had shown to others. Stalin's body remained in the mausoleum on Red Square next to Lenin until 1961, when Khrushchev, now firmly in power, ordered it removed and reburied in a less prominent location near the Kremlin wall. Khrushchev had begun the process of de-Stalinization, publicly denouncing Stalin's crimes and personality cult in his famous secret speech of 1956. Looking back at Stalin's final 24 hours, what stands out is the pervasive fear that defined his regime even at its end. Stalin spent his last conscious hours demonstrating power over his subordinates, keeping them up until dawn, watching them drink and exhaust themselves, reminding them that he controlled their schedules and their fates. Then, when Stalin collapsed, that same atmosphere of fear prevented anyone from acting quickly. The guards were afraid to enter his room. The ministers were afraid to summon doctors immediately. The doctors, when they finally arrived, were afraid to treat him aggressively. Everyone was paralyzed by terror of doing the wrong thing. That terror was Stalin's final legacy. He had built a system where fear was the primary organizing principle, where everyone suspected everyone else, where the penalty for error was death. And in the end, that system failed him. The fear he had so carefully cultivated kept people from acting to save his life. Whether Beria poisoned Stalin or simply allowed him to die, whether the delay in medical care was malicious or just the predictable result of a terrorized bureaucracy, the ultimate cause of Stalin's death was the atmosphere he had created. He died alone on his dacha floor, unable to call for help, because he had made everyone too afraid to approach him. The final 24 hours of Joseph Stalin's life began with him wielding absolute power over 4 of the most important men in the Soviet Union, keeping them captive at his dinner table until dawn. Those hours ended with him helpless and dying, while those same 4 men decided whether he lived or died. The tyrant who had controlled so much found he couldn't control his own mortality. Stalin's death closed a chapter of Soviet history, but it didn't end the system he built. The Soviet Union would continue for another 38 years. The Cold War would rage for decades. Millions more would suffer under communist dictatorships around the world. But March 5, 1953, marked the end of Stalin's personal reign of terror. The man who had caused so much death finally met his own. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.